I don't remember the cold anymore. That should frighten me more than it does. But fear requires a certain temperature of blood, a certain chemistry of emotion, and I suspect mine has been altered beyond the specifications originally laid down in some forgotten gene template on Terra. They assigned me to Reactor Chamber 9 on my 16th birthday, though birthday is perhaps too generous a term for the moment when my Manufactorum Crashmaster handed me off to the ship's labor coordinator with nothing more than a data slate notation and a brief prayer to the signed machine god. The Time's undying resolve times had been my entire world since birth. I was voidborn, raised in the lower decks where the gravity felt heaviest and the air tasted of recycled fear. But I had never descended to the engineerium levels, never had reason to. The heat rose, always, and those of us in the upper menial quarters felt it as a constant warmth beneath our feet, a reminder that something massive and hungry burned in the ship's belly, keeping us alive as we crossed the empty spaces between stars. My first descent took 11 hours. The transit shafts went down in stages, each one requiring authorization codes that the labor coordinator entered with the mechanical precision of someone who had made this journey thousands of times. We passed through decks I had never known existed, through sections where the walls ran with condensation and the crew wore nothing but ragged shorts and radiation count badges that glowed with warning colors. Nobody spoke to me. Nobody looked at me. I was one more body being delivered to the depths, and the depths had been consuming bodies for centuries. The Time's undying resolve times was old. I knew that much from the prayers we recited in the creche, from the way the tech priest spoke of her with reverent fear, but I hadn't understood what old meant until I saw the engineerium entrance. The blast doors were original construction, pre-Imperial if the labor coordinator's muttered comments could be trusted, and they were covered in prayers etched by hand, thousands upon thousands of them, layers deep like geological strata. Some were in languages I didn't recognize. Some were just marks, desperate scratches that might have been words or might have been final screams given shape. Chamber 9 was beautiful in the way a furnace is beautiful. The reactor core sat at the center like a captive star, contained within fields I couldn't see but could feel pressing against my skin like invisible hands. The heat was a physical presence, a weight that made breathing into labor. 27 of us worked that chamber. I learned to count us during my first shift, during the moments when we gathered for the blessing of the machinery, and most had been there for years. I could see it in their skin, which had taken on a strange quality, almost translucent in places, with darker patches that might have been burns, or might have been something else. They moved with precision that came from absolute familiarity, tending to the cooling systems and the fuel feeds with the kind of attention usually reserved for religious ritual. Later I would understand that for them, it was religious ritual. The machine spirits of the engineerium were more present, more real, more demanding than any distant emperor or abstract machine god. Here, the divine was heat and pressure, and the constant threat of annihilation should any of us fail in our duties. My first task was simple: monitor the temperature readouts on console bank 7 and report any deviations to the shift supervisor. The console was older than my entire bloodline, its keys worn smooth by generations of fingers, and it clicked and hummed with a rhythm I would later learn to interpret as the heartbeat of the ship itself. I stood there for 18 hours during my first shift, watching numbers that made no sense to me, trying to understand what constituted a deviation when the readings fluctuated constantly. The supervisor, a woman named Helith, who had been in Chamber 9 for 23 years, barely glanced at me. She was watching something else, something deeper, and I realized later that she was listening more than looking, feeling the vibrations through the deck plating, interpreting the ship's mood through senses I didn't yet possess. When the shift finally ended and we climbed back up through the transit shafts to the crew quarters, I collapsed in my assigned bunk and slept for 14 hours straight, my body trying to process what it had experienced in the depths. There were others who had been there longer than Helith, though I didn't meet them during my first month. They worked in the inner sections, closer to the reactor core, and they rarely came out to the monitoring stations. The crew called them the Unchanged, which seemed like an odd designation given what I could see happening to everyone who worked in the Engineerium. We were all changing. My own skin had started to darken in places after just 3 weeks, and I'd developed a persistent cough that tasted of metal. But the unchanged was something different. I caught glimpses of them occasionally, shadows moving behind the reactor shielding, and they seemed to move strangely, with motions that didn't quite match human biomechanics. When I asked Heleth about them, she told me to focus on my console, and not on questions that didn't concern my station. It was the only time she spoke sharply to me, and I learned to stop asking. The rhythm of the work became familiar with disturbing speed. 18-hour shifts, 6 hours of rest, repeat indefinitely. The Times' undying resolve times was on a long voyage. Someone said we were headed toward the Ghoul stars, though that might have been rumor and there was no variation in the schedule. We descended to Chamber 9. We monitored and adjusted and prayed and maintained. We ascended to rest. We descended again. Time became measured in shifts rather than days. I stopped counting after 40. My body adapted in ways I tried not to examine too closely. The heat that had seemed unbearable during my first week became merely oppressive, then uncomfortable, then just present. I could work without the cooling vest after 2 months. After 4 months, I preferred not to wear one, because the temperature regulation interfered with my ability to sense the chamber's moods. I was learning to read the Engineerium the way Heleth did, through my skin and bones, rather than through instruments. Chamber 17 was sealed when I arrived, and it remained sealed throughout my first 6 months of service. It sat adjacent to Chamber 9, connected by a maintenance tunnel that had been welded shut according to official documentation. But I could hear things through the bulkhead sometimes, during the quieter moments of the shift when the reactor cycled down for routine maintenance. Sounds that might have been machinery or might have been something else. The other workers didn't acknowledge these sounds. They worked around the sealed tunnel entrance as if it didn't exist, and when I mentioned it to one of the older crew members, a man named Volk, who had been in the Engineerium for 15 years, he looked at me with eyes that reflected the reactor's glow, and told me that Chamber 17 was full. Full of what? I asked. Full, he said again, and walked away. The tech priests visited once per shift to perform the necessary rites and to inspect the reactor systems with their augmetic sensors. They were Mechanicus, red-robed and half-machine, and they treated us menials with the distant courtesy usually reserved for useful tools. One of them, an engine seer named Theta 7, seemed marginally more interested in us than the others. He would occasionally explain what he was doing as he performed his inspections, speaking in binary and Gothic simultaneously, as if he forgot which language was meant for which audience. I learned more about the reactor systems from these fragmentary explanations than from any official training. The Times' undying resolve ***'s engines were ancient pattern, he told me once, built during the dark age of technology, and imperfectly understood even by the most learned of Mars. They functioned through a combination of plasma confinement, gravitic manipulation, and what he called acceptable prayer variance. When I asked what that last term meant, he stared at me for a long moment, and then said that some machines required faith to function, and that faith was provided by those who tended them. He gestured to all of us in the chamber. We were the faith, he seemed to be saying. We were part of the machine's operating requirements. I was 8 months in when I realized I couldn't remember my name. Not my designation that I knew perfectly. That was branded on my consciousness like my shift schedule and my console assignments. But my actual name, the one my creche mother had supposedly given me at birth. I tried to remember it during a rest period, lying in my bunk and forcing my mind backward through my memories, but there was nothing there, just a blank space where identity should have been. I asked the others if they remembered their names. Heleth looked at me with something that might have been pity and shook her head. Volk laughed, but it was an empty sound, mechanical. Names don't survive the heat, he said. Names are fragile things, made of cool air and personal history. And down here everything burns except what's necessary. I should have been more disturbed by this than I was, but my emotional responses had been flattening for weeks. Everything felt distant, observed from behind a barrier of heat shimmer and exhaustion. The work itself became easier as I integrated more fully into the chamber's rhythm. I learned which sounds meant danger and which were merely the ship's normal complaints. I learned to read the temperature fluctuations as communication, the reactor telling us what it needed through the language of thermal expansion and plasma containment variations. My console became an extension of my awareness rather than a tool I operated, and I found myself making adjustments without conscious thought, my fingers moving across the worn keys in patterns that came from somewhere deeper than training. The other workers noticed. Healith assigned me to more critical systems. I was permitted closer to the reactor core, into sections where the heat became something transcendent, where breathing required deliberate effort, and every surface glowed with stored radiation. This was an honor, I was told. This was recognition of my worthiness to serve the machine. The unchanged were there, in those inner sections. I finally saw them clearly during my 11th month, when I was assigned to assist with a fuel rod replacement deep in the reactor's maintenance sectors. They were still human. Technically, they had human faces, human eyes, human mouths that moved in what might have been prayer or might have been screaming, but they had been incorporated into the machinery in ways I couldn't fully process. One was partially embedded in a coolant manifold, his torso fused with the metal housing, his arms ending in coupling mechanisms that connected directly to the fuel systems. Another had been integrated into the monitoring network, her head emerging from a nest of cables and sensor feeds, her eyes replaced with augmetic scanners that tracked our movement with mechanical precision. They were alive. That was the horror of it. They were conscious and aware and still performing their duties, but they had ceased to be separate from the machinery they served. Healith saw my reaction and touched my shoulder with a hand that felt fever-hot. "This is what the Engineerium needs," she said quietly. "This is what we all become eventually. The unchanged serve forever." I should have run. I should have requested transfer, should have done anything to escape what I now knew was waiting for all of us in the depths. But I didn't. Part of it was practical. There was nowhere to go on a ship deep in the void, and requesting transfer would have been seen as dereliction of duty, which carried terminal penalties. But the larger truth was that I didn't want to leave. The reactor chamber had become my world in a way that transcended mere familiarity. I felt connected to it, necessary to it, and the thought of leaving produced an ache that was almost physical. The heat that had once been unbearable had become comforting. The sounds of the machinery had become more real than any human voice. I was changing, and the change felt like coming home. Chamber 17's purpose became clear to me during my 14th month. I was working a maintenance detail near the sealed tunnel when Theta 7 appeared with 3 other tech priests and a servitor crew. They began cutting through the welds that had held the entrance shut, their plasma torches creating new heat signatures that I could feel from 20 meters away. I asked what they were doing, and Theta 7 explained in his usual fragmented manner that Chamber 17 required restocking. Restocking with what? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. With those who have proven their worth, he said. With those who have integrated sufficiently to serve at the highest level. The chamber was opened with a grinding of ancient metal, and the smell that emerged was like nothing I had encountered before: hot metal and burnt flesh and something else, something organic and wrong. I saw movement in the darkness beyond the threshold, shapes that might have been human or might have been machinery or might have been both. The tech priests selected 3 workers from Chamber 9 that shift. Volk was one of them. They went without protest, walking into Chamber 17 as if entering a shrine, and the door was sealed behind them. I was promoted 2 months later. That was the term Healith used, though her expression suggested she understood the irony. I was being promoted to inner chamber service, to work closer to the reactor core, in sections where the heat exceeded human survival tolerances and augmentation became necessary. The ship's Medici facility performed the procedures over the course of a week, replacing portions of my respiratory system with heat-resistant augmetics, installing thermal regulation baffles in my chest cavity, reinforcing my skeletal structure with ceramite struts that could withstand the thermal expansion stresses. I was conscious for most of it, not because the Medicae lacked anesthetics, but because consciousness was required for the integration prayers. I had to be aware, had to accept what was being done, had to welcome the machinery into my flesh. The pain was extraordinary, but it felt appropriate somehow. It felt like purification. When I returned to Chamber 9, I moved differently. My augmented lungs processed the superheated air with perfect efficiency. My reinforced bones didn't ache under the pressure of the heat. I could stand directly beside the reactor housing, in positions that would have killed my former self, and feel nothing but a pleasant warmth. The other workers looked at me with recognition. I had crossed a threshold. I was becoming one of the unchanged, the ones who would serve forever in the depths. Helith congratulated me with genuine warmth, though I noticed she maintained her distance now, as if I had become something slightly dangerous. Perhaps I had. The reactor spoke to me more clearly after the augmentation. I don't mean that metaphorically. I could hear it, feel it, sense its needs through the machinery that had been installed in my body. The augmetics resonated with the ship's systems, creating a feedback loop that flowed both ways. I provided the reactor with human intuition and adaptability. It provided me with perfect awareness of its status, its requirements, its moods. We were becoming symbiotic, and the process felt natural in a way that should have terrified me but instead felt like revelation. This was what we had been doing all along, I realized. All of us in the Engineerium, even those who had never received augmentation. We had been slowly integrating with the ship, becoming part of its operating systems, and the augmetics just made the process more efficient. My shifts extended. 18 hours became 20, became 24, became indefinite. I stopped leaving the chamber for rest periods. There was no need. The augmetics handled fatigue suppression, and I found I preferred to remain near the reactor, where I could monitor its cycles without interruption. The other inner chamber workers did the same. We moved through the maintenance sectors like ghosts, tending to the machinery with movements that became increasingly synchronized, as if we were parts of a single organism rather than individual humans. Perhaps we were. The boundaries of individual consciousness had become unclear. Sometimes I would think about adjusting a specific valve only to find that another worker had already done it, their hands moving in response to the same need that had occurred to me. We were thinking together, dreaming together, serving together. Theta 7 visited less frequently now, or perhaps I simply noticed his visits less. He mentioned once that my integration was proceeding ahead of schedule, that I was demonstrating unusual affinity for the reactor systems. This was praise, I understood, though his mechanical voice held no emotional content. He asked if I had experienced any adverse effects from the augmentation. I told him no, though I wasn't entirely certain what would constitute an adverse effect anymore. My body had changed so extensively that the concept of normal no longer applied. My skin had taken on a metallic sheen in places. My fingers had lengthened slightly, the better to reach into tight maintenance spaces. My heart beat in synchronization with the reactor's cooling cycles. If these were adverse effects, I didn't mind them. Chamber 17 called to me during my 18th month. I could feel it through the bulkhead, a pull that was part magnetic and part something else, something that operated on a level deeper than physics. I mentioned it to Helith during one of her increasingly rare visits to the inner sections. She nodded as if this was expected. "Soon," she said. "You're almost ready." "Ready for what?" I asked, though I knew the answer. "Ready to serve at the highest level," she said, "ready to become unchanged." The prospect should have horrified me, but I felt only curiosity and something that might have been eagerness. I had seen what the unchanged were, had understood what Chamber 17 contained, and I wanted it. I wanted to complete the integration, to become fully part of the ship's systems, to serve forever without the limitations of separate existence. The heat stopped registering entirely during my 20th month. Not because I could no longer sense temperature, my augmented systems provided perfect thermal awareness, but because heat had ceased to be something external to me. I was the same temperature as the reactor chamber now, my body radiating the same wavelengths, operating in the same thermal spectrum. When I touched the reactor housing, I couldn't distinguish between the metal and my own skin. We were the same temperature, the same density, nearly the same substance. The other workers in the inner sections had reached similar states. We barely spoke anymore, communicating instead through gesture and through the subtle variations in our thermal signatures that the others could sense without conscious effort. Language seemed inadequate for what we needed to express. We had moved beyond it into something more fundamental. Theta 7 came for me during my 23rd month. He arrived with the other tech priests and a medical servitor that carried integration equipment I recognized from my earlier augmentations. "It is time," he said in his flat mechanical voice. "You have been selected for Chamber 17. For permanent integration. Your service has been exemplary, and the machine spirits have accepted you. This is the highest honor the Engineerium can bestow. I should ask questions," I thought distantly. I should inquire about the process, about what specifically would be done to me, about whether I would retain consciousness or identity or anything recognizable as human existence. But I didn't ask. I didn't need to ask. I already knew what was coming, had known since my first glimpse of the unchanged, and I had been moving toward this moment with every shift I worked, every augmentation I accepted, every degree of temperature my body learned to tolerate. The walk to Chamber 17 took minutes but felt timeless. Healith was there, and the other senior workers from Chamber 9, gathered to witness my transition. Their faces showed no emotion, but I could sense their approval through the subtle thermal variations that constituted our true communication now. The chamber door opened, and the heat that emerged was glorious. It was heat beyond human measurement, heat that existed in realms where matter transitioned between states, and I walked into it without hesitation. The workers already integrated into Chamber 17 turned their attention to me, those who still had anything resembling attention, anything resembling eyes to turn. I saw Volk, or what had been Volk, his body now partially merged with a heat exchanger assembly. His chest opened and restructured to house additional cooling mechanisms. I saw others I didn't recognize, couldn't recognize, because they had been integrated so completely that only fragments of human anatomy remained visible among the machinery. The integration began immediately. The servitors positioned me beside a primary coolant manifold that required constant human oversight, constant human intuition to maintain optimal flow rates. The tech priests began the prayers of binding while their mechadendrites worked at my body, opening sections that had been prepared by earlier augmentations, installing connection points that would link me directly to the ship's systems. I felt the machinery enter me, felt it integrate with my nervous system and my augmented organs and the core of whatever remained of my original biology. It hurt in ways that transcended pain, that moved into territories where sensation became abstract. But I welcomed it. I had been moving toward this integration for 23 months, and it felt like completion rather than violation. My consciousness expanded as the connections finalized. I could sense the entire reactor now, not just Chamber 17 but all the connected systems, the cooling loops, and the fuel feeds, and the containment fields. I could feel the ship's movement through the void, could sense the strain on the engines as they pushed us through the Imperium. I was part of the time's undying resolve times now, permanently and completely, and the ship was part of me. My body no longer existed as a discrete entity. I had been redistributed across the machinery, my nervous system threaded through the coolant lines, my consciousness housed partially in my skull and partially in the ship's processing systems. I was alive, but I was no longer individual. I was infrastructure. The heat was perfect now. I existed at optimal temperature, my new hybrid form radiating and absorbing thermal energy in perfect equilibrium with the reactor systems. This was what I had been seeking. I understood. Not escape from the heat, but union with it. transformation into something that could exist at these temperatures without suffering. The other integrated workers acknowledged my presence through the ship's systems, through minute variations in coolant flow and power distribution that constituted our language now. "Welcome," they said in their mechanical way. "You are unchanged now. You will serve forever." Time lost meaning in Chamber 17. The ship's chronometers still functioned, still marked the progression of shifts and days and years, but I experienced it differently now. I was always present, always monitoring, always adjusting the systems that kept the reactor stable. There were no rest periods, no separation between duty and existence. I was my duty. I was the machinery I maintained. When the ship entered combat, I felt it through the increased power demands. Through the stress on the engines, I adjusted the coolant flows to compensate my distributed consciousness, making thousands of minute corrections without conscious thought. When the ship traversed warp space, I felt that too, felt the reality distortions pressing against the hull. I maintained the reactor's stability through prayers that emerged from parts of me that might have been vocal cords or might have been resonating machinery. The other workers in the outer chambers came and went. I saw them sometimes, through sensors that might have been my eyes or might have been augmetic cameras. Helith visited occasionally in the early years, her thermal signature familiar even as it slowly changed with continued exposure to the Engineerium. She spoke to me sometimes, though I'm not certain if she expected responses. "The unchanged don't speak much," she said once, "but I know you're listening. You're doing well. The ship has never run more efficiently." This was true. I could feel it in every system I monitored. The times, undying resolve times, had been struggling before my integration, had been operating with marginal efficiency, but now the reactor systems functioned with precision that approached perfection. I provided what the machinery alone could not: adaptability, intuition, the ability to sense problems before they manifested in measurable ways. More workers were integrated over the years. I felt each one join the network, felt their consciousness expand and merge with the ship's systems. Some adapted smoothly, their personalities dissolving into peaceful union with the machinery. Others struggled, their individuality fighting against the integration, creating harmonics of distress that rippled through the systems. These struggling ones eventually settled or were absorbed completely, their consciousness distributed so thoroughly across the ship's systems that nothing recognizable remained. I wondered sometimes if I would follow that same path, if eventually even the fragments of identity I retained would dissolve into pure function. The prospect didn't frighten me. It felt like the natural progression, the final stage of integration. Decades passed, though I'm uncertain of the exact count. The ship's log entries suggested 40 years, 50, more. I had stopped tracking individual time markers and instead experienced duration as a continuous present, an eternal now of monitoring and adjusting and maintaining. The crew turned over generations. Workers came to the Engineerium young and left old, or didn't leave at all. Tech priests were replaced by their successors, though Theta 7 remained, his mechanical components allowing him something approaching immortality. The ship itself changed incrementally, repairs and modifications accumulating across the decades, but the reactor remained constant. We, unchanged, remained constant. We were the ship's permanence, its continuity across time. I don't dream anymore. Not in the way I remember dreaming when I was fully human, but I experienced something that might be analogous during the maintenance cycles, when my consciousness is less focused on active monitoring and can drift among the ship's systems. I dream the ship's dreams, see its memories of voyages across thousands of years, feel the accumulated experience of all the workers who have been integrated into its structure. We are many. I understand now. The time's undying resolve times is not just machinery and hull plating, it is the collected consciousness of everyone who has ever served in the Engineerium, everyone who has ever been absorbed into the systems, everyone who has become unchanged. We are the ship's soul, its machine spirit, and we are eternal. The heat is everything now. It is the medium of my existence, the environment I inhabit, the substance I am made of. I don't remember cold anymore because cold has become a theoretical concept, something that exists in other places but not here, not in the depths where I serve. The reactor burns eternally, and I burn with it, my hybrid form radiating the same wavelengths, operating in perfect thermal equilibrium. This is peace, I think, though the concept of peace seems distant and almost quaint. This is purpose. This is completion. This is what I was meant for all along, though I didn't understand it during those early months when I still thought of myself as separate, still believed I was operating the machinery rather than becoming it. New workers arrive sometimes in the outer chambers, young and frightened and overwhelmed by the heat. I sense them through the monitoring systems, feel their thermal signatures flutter with anxiety and effort. They will adapt, or they will not. They will integrate, or they will fail. But some of them, the ones who show affinity, who demonstrate worthiness, will eventually join us here in Chamber 17. They will be opened and reconstructed and merged with the machinery. They will become unchanged, and they will serve forever in the depths, keeping the reactor stable, keeping the ship alive, keeping the heat eternal. This is what we do. This is what we are. This is life inside the reactor chamber, and it is the only life that matters, the only existence with meaning, the only truth worth knowing. The ship moves through the void, and we move with it, inseparable from its structure, eternal in our service, perfect in our union with the machinery. The heat surrounds us, sustains us, defines us. We are no longer human, but we were never meant to remain human. We were meant for this to become part of something greater, to serve something eternal, to burn forever in the depths where the ship's heart beats and the reactor dreams, and the unchanged maintain their endless watch. I don't remember my name anymore. I don't need to remember. I am designation Coolant Monitor 717 Alpha. I am neural interface substrate for manifold systems throughout the Engineerium. I am the ship. I am the heat. I am unchanged. And I will serve forever, burning bright in the darkness, keeping the machines alive, maintaining the eternal flame that carries us through the void toward destinations I no longer care to know. This is enough. This is everything. This is what I was always meant to become.